Previously on Dark Side of the Ring.
If you're a wrestling fan, how could you not be a fan of Chris Benoit's work?
This is my favorite page because this is the love that Chris and Nancy always had.
Chris was always very much a great father, very much about his family.
He was my hero, you know? I looked up to him.
I have never, ever seen a closer friendship as I did between Chris and Eddie.
Eddie Guerrero has passed away.
My next thought was, oh my God, Chris.
I love you, Eddie.
He didn't handle it well. Let me just say it like that.
Nancy started getting really worried. She's like, I'm really worried for Chris. I just had this really bad feeling.
We have more for you now on a developing story in Fayette County, the deaths of a pro wrestler and his family.
In the immediate wake of Chris Benoit's death, the world is desperately searching for answers. What comes to light goes beyond anything anyone could imagine.
People just couldn't believe it, couldn't fathom that something like that could happen.
It can't be real. Like, where's my nephew?
That can't have happened because the person that I knew would not do this horrific thing.
But I think this is going to be gigantic. This will affect WWE.
Well, the question is, was he on steroids at this time?
Did the blows to the head Benoit received in the wrestling ring fundamentally change his brain?
It really, really was the darkest time of my life.
Fayette County, Georgia is a laid-back community. It's more of a family atmosphere. Not a whole lot of crime. It's pretty peaceful. My name is Larry Alden. I was with the Fayette County Sheriff's Office. I was a lieutenant in charge of the shift that was working the day of the Benoit incident. I had been a detective for about 15 or 20 years. I'd probably see Chris Benoit once or twice a week at the gym, which was right in the middle of Fayetteville. He didn't talk a lot, and he was pretty focused on getting his workout in. I never heard anything about him. I didn't even know where he lived at until the call came out on the radio that day.
My name is Dennis Fig, and I run the security for World Wrestling, and one of our wrestlers that lives down there is missing.
And what's his name?
Chris Benoit.
Okay, and he's a wrestler?
Yes, what happened, he's a very religious gentleman, and yesterday he was supposed to show up at a pay-per-view and never got on the plane, never showed up. It's out of character for him.
All right, we'll go ahead and send somebody out there to check on him. If you want to call us back in like 45 minutes or so. If he's there, we'll tell him to give you a call.
I was in my patrol car just riding around the county, and it was pretty close to the area when the call went out. I wasn't thinking of anything other than a welfare check, or maybe he was sick, maybe drunk, didn't really know what. I pulled up on scene about the time the neighbor was walking over, and I walked up to them, and I asked if she had seen Mr. Benoit or anybody. And she said, it's been 3 or 4 days since I've seen anybody over there. There was 2 large canines in the yard. If I remember correctly, they were German Shepherds. We asked her if there was any place she could put the dogs at so we could go up there and do the welfare check. And she said, oh yeah, me and the dogs get along great. I feed them whenever they're out of town. And she jumped the fence, dogs right there with her. She walked them in there, never had to take a hold to them. It was taking a little longer than I thought it should take, but then she came running out the door, screaming that Daniel's dead, Daniel's dead. I went from just being a regular welfare check, okay, we got something more serious here. We crossed the fence at that time, myself and Deputy Mundy, and we made entry through the side door, which she had left open. We drew our weapons, not knowing what we was going to come upon. It was daylight, and they had plenty of windows in the house, so you had a lot of light coming in. There was an odor in the house. And I looked over at Deputy Mundy and said, something is dead in here. There was a set of stairs going up to a bedroom. So we went up those steps, and sure enough, that's where the juvenile child was at, laying in bed. I noticed the child was laying on the bed face down. Deputy Mundy said, do we need to start CPR? And I said, no, he'd passed away. We started clearing all the different rooms and doors. We found another room, and that's where we found Miss Benoit at. She was laying on the floor, and she was wrapped up in a blanket or maybe a rug or something like that. Went downstairs to the basement area, which was a couple of large open rooms. And the last door we opened was the gym door. And that's where Mr. Benoit was at. Because of the mirrors and at the angle Deputy Mundy was at to my right, she saw the reflection at the far end of the room, which might have been 5 to 7, 10 feet away from where he actually was. And she started to say, "Show me your hands, Fayette County Sheriff's Department." She could not see. He had a cable from one of his weight machines around his neck and had some weights on it. That's when I told her, I said, "He's sitting right here, he's passed away." Radio had called us, asked if everything was okay, and I told them on the radio that looked like it might be a homicide and suicide. It was within 2 or 3 minutes of us walking back outside that somebody had already strung crime scene tape across the front of the property.
I was at the gym, and I remember I was driving home. My son was with me, and I got a call from one of the writers from WWE who called me and said, "Are you sitting down?" I'm like, "What's going on here, dude?" And that's what he said, "Chris is dead." And I said, "What? Chris who?" And he says, "Chris Benoit." And I pulled over on the side of the road, and I just started bawling. And I remember my son, he said, "Daddy, you cry funny." I was just crying, just bawling.
At this time, no one knew what happened. So WWE is just thinking that Chris Benoit has passed away, along with Nancy and Daniel. You're not trying to put together that, okay, did someone break in? Did carbon monoxide happen? What's going on? You just know that these two of your friends are gone, and no one has answers.
Vince McMahon, the chairman of the board, couldn't go on the air and not do anything. So we went on the air and did what we thought was right.
Tonight, this arena here in Corpus Christi, Texas, was to have been filled to capacity with enthusiastic WWE fans.
We tried to honor the guy, we tried to honor his family, tried to honor his fans, but we didn't have a full story. Shame on us for that, I guess.
So tonight will be a 3-hour tribute to one of the greatest WWE superstars of all time.
We just know that Chris Benoit is no longer with us, and neither is his family. Of course I'm going to pay tribute to my friend.
And I would trust you with me, with my life, with my kids' lives. Because I know you, Chris. I know your heart.
Yeah, they called me and asked me if I wanted to be on it. And I was like, absolutely not. I remember just sitting there, like, just watching, like, dead, the bottle of vodka, just drinking, like, you know, because Eddie's was bad. This was worse.
Chris Benoit was not only one of the greatest wrestlers I ever saw, but he was one of the best friends I ever had in this business.
We did not know all the information. That's our fault. We were trying to serve the audience. It was a major story. It was hitting all the news sources, and we had a TV show. We wanted to update people on what the hell was going on. But we didn't have all the information. But we didn't know we didn't have all the information. We were told from the authorities, here's what happened. Oh, guess what? We were wrong. This is not what happened.
Chris was the type of guy you'd want to go to war with.
It was hard because at that time, some guys were, you know, in their speeches, you know, praising Chris.
Because Chris Benoit was my hero.
I love you, Chris.
It's interesting to me because when I watched the Raw tribute and everybody was talking about Benoit and how great a performer he was and how amazing he was, but I thought Regal's words on that night were very revealing.
Now all I'm willing to say is that Chris Benoit was undoubtedly the hardest working man in professional wrestling.
And when you talk to him afterwards, you find out he lived in the same city as Chris and knew a lot about whatever fights Nancy and him had or whatever Chris was going through at the time. And I'm not sure if a lot of people would have noticed it, but knowing what I knew about him, I started thinking, wow, this is not good.
My sister had told me to spoil myself and go to the mall and get some makeup and have some wine with lunch and go watch a movie. And I came out of the theater and I turned my phone on and I had like 22 missed calls from my parents. And my parents made sure they wouldn't tell me anything. They wanted me to be parked in my driveway and inside my house before they told me. And that's how I found out. And then when it finally sunk in, I just absolutely lost control of myself. It was very difficult. Very difficult. I had to go to the hospital and be sedated.
I was in Edmonton, and then this number kept calling. My mom's cell phone, unknown number, unknown number, unknown number. And then she finally answered it, and it was the police, RCMP. So we left, rolled down to the station. She found out first. I see her crying there. She couldn't spit it out, so. The cop told me that they all passed away over the weekend. I punched them in the chest. And then me and the cop went for a walk. We talked. And that, you know, your dad loved you. They all loved you. And I thought it was a joke. I really did.
It wasn't until after the show and after the fact that all the details started coming in.
We have more for you now on a developing story in Fayette County, the deaths of a pro wrestler and his family. Fayetteville authorities say the bodies of Chris Benoit and his family were found this afternoon in their home.
Right now it's being investigated as a murder-suicide. However, until we get the crime lab reports, it's undetermined exactly what happened.
That's when all of this, you know, all of these details start coming out about it's not just him that's dead, it's Nancy, and then Daniel's dead as well. And then that's when it just started getting out of control.
The father killed his wife and son and then committed suicide. That's what's happened here. You didn't want to believe it. Can't believe it. Can't be true. But it was.
The evidence indicates that it was a particularly brutal and vicious murder. It was something that showed some sign of real rage. I'm Matthew Randazzo V, and I'm the author of Ring of Hell, the story of Chris Benoit and the fall of the pro wrestling industry. The weekend of the murders, on Friday, Chris Benoit had a barbecue out by the pool with Daniel. And then that Friday evening, it appears that there was some sort of altercation between Chris and Nancy, that Chris restrained Nancy with duct tape and then utilized a telephone cord to strangle her, and then placed a Bible next to her body. There were a number of beer cans and wine bottles around that indicate Chris may have been drinking. Next morning, on Saturday, Chris, we assume, gave his son Daniel Xanax and then murdered him in his room, being suffocated by his father. A Bible was then placed next to Daniel as well.
And my dad, to calm him down,
Chris made a phone call,
which I think did the opposite. Up and drive 8 hours to the next show.
Stomach virus.
I don't know exactly when the evolution happened from smoking marijuana and drinking booze to...
On Sunday,
I know
Benoit
he missed
makes a
being
couple
home.
searches on the internet that are chilling in retrospect. One for a story in the Bible about the prophet Elijah and the resurrection of a dead boy in the Old Testament. And then a search about the quickest and most painless way of breaking one's own neck. Chris then went down to his home gym with a half-drunken bottle of wine. He went to his lat pull-down machine. He took the bar off. He wrapped a towel around his neck, and he took the metal cord from the lat pull-down machine and put it around his neck. He adjusted the weights to 240 pounds, and then he released it. So it's a very bizarre scenario. It's a very bizarre weekend, and it doesn't leave a lot of answers.
He was just a guy, you know, like my friend. Nobody expects their friend to kill their family. Like, what?
When I found out what had really happened, the shock is just, you can't even believe it. He had put his knee in her back and essentially broke her back. I couldn't fathom how cruel and how much pain she must have gone through and how horrific that must have been for her. It was just unfathomable.
If Chris did give Daniel that, you know, medication or prescription pills, and suffocate him, you know, like, shame on him. Daniel was innocent in all this.
We were hearing other things come out about the circumstances of him putting the Bibles by their sides and having a knife that he had planted underneath Daniel's bed or something like that.
Still couldn't wrap my head around it. It just sounded so like some bad horror movie.
And now I'm a part of humanizing murderer. Strange.
I mean, to think that Nancy was dead for 2 days before Chris took his life, how was that even logical for this man who loved her so much?
Later, it turned out that there was a Bible in the house, similar to the ones left by Nancy and Daniel's body, that Chris had left something akin to a suicide note. Something along the lines of, I'm preparing to leave this earth. So Chris did leave a suicide note. He did know what he was doing. He was at least enough in his right mind to understand exactly what was happening, and was still considering whether he would go make a flight to go wrestle that night on international television.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
We came up on air and
Had lost a lot of his motor skills.
Last night on Monday Night
He
Raw,
was
WWE presented
very
a special
slow to
tribute show,
react.
recognizing
He
the
had to
career of
relearn a
Chris
lot of
Benoit.
things.
Even teaching my uncle, you know, this is how it goes, remember? Remember?
Are now apparent.
There was progress.
Therefore, other than
And
my comments, there will be no mention of Mr. Benoit's name tonight.
It was understood that we were not to speak of Chris, speak of Benoit, speak of anyone of that incident. And by that next week, Chris's name was erased from everything that was involved with WWE. I mean, when we did interviews, we were not to mention Chris Benoit. So that's something that was really hard for us to do, but because we all wanted our jobs, it was understood.
I know WWE has kind of like erased his history of being in the business, and I can understand and totally agree with what they did. We're not going to praise a guy who murdered his wife or his son or give him any accolades for that.
I went to the funeral of Nancy and Daniel. I can't even believe how sad that was. I was the WWE representative there, just me, with the shits. To go to a funeral and people crying and a kid being buried and a woman being married for no reason. No reason to die.
The WWE sent JR, and I lost my cool with him and told him to his face that he wasn't welcome at the wake afterward. It was all a work, just fake, garbage, nonsense. I can see a work coming a mile away, and that's what I saw, and I knew that that was the truth.
I felt like I was the most unwanted person in the building because I was a WWE guy. And I probably loved him as much as anybody there.
Everybody was just a mess. It's shitty, and it's sad, and it's unfair because there's two people that could still be with us today. And if Chris wanted to take his life, then so be it. But to take all of them, I didn't go to Chris's funeral. I was angry. At that point, I was pretty angry at Chris, you know, for what he did.
His funeral, it was very private. We didn't tell anyone about it. That's when it all hit me right there, all at once. I was crying my eyes out.
Who in the wrestling business provided care for you and your family in the aftermath of this?
Is that a serious question? Not a single person. No one.
And did anyone from the WWE ever reach out to you and your family?
Chris Jericho and Chavo Guerrero. That's it. Nobody else. You know? Screw them. They weren't there for me. You know? They backed off like I didn't even exist. It was so hard after the funeral because the media was just non-stop, 24/7.
Tonight, we are talking about the strange and very sad case of Chris Benoit.
I didn't even watch the news anymore. I didn't watch TV
past
for
overdose.
months. I couldn't even watch
First time
anymore.
he dropped on me, he just dropped and I did CPR and ambulance took him. He was in the hospital. I didn't remember what happened when they brought me in.
It really, really was the darkest time of my life.
Benoit had an intense on-stage persona. He was nicknamed the Rabid Wolverine, the Canadian Crippler. The couple actually met when her former husband drew up a script that had put the two of them in a relationship.
It made everything extremely difficult. It made everything under a magnifying glass because CNN and Fox and all the news channels were at the gates. You know, a double murder-suicide with a 7-year-old kid is news. But I think that there's a point where you really just need to let the family grieve. All I really wanted to do was to be with my niece and nephew.
The mainstream media's reaction was typical because, A, they love tragedy.
That reveled commitment to the rock and roll lifestyle.
Once the jack started flowing, the birds were ready to party with it.
Until a flight on a routine trip to Japan.
Even though he came back, he didn't come back.
I think a lot of mainstream media looks down on wrestling as it is, and that suddenly it was public enemy number one.
Chris Benoit's diary is revealing new information about his state of mind. The wrestler wrote a series of letters to his best friend. At one point, Benoit wrote, "I'll be with you soon."
Mike Benoit believes it's the diary of his son going mad.
We just didn't understand this was going on at that time in Chris's life.
I got a call from Chris's dad, Mike Benoit, because he knew my relationship with Chris. The first thing he asked me was why. Which from a father's standpoint, I can understand how upset he was. You know, unfortunately, and I felt bad, I didn't have any answers for him.
People need to understand that that was not him. Not the person we knew. The person I loved with all my heart, my hero.
The term that's been being thrown around everywhere is roid rage. Some say steroid abuse is rampant at the organization, and everyone just turns a blind eye to this.
The media's initial response to the Benoit tragedy was that this was a roid rage incident.
Where do steroids stand in the bizarre Benoit deaths?
Pro wrestling, when Chris Benoit entered it in the 1980s, was extremely discriminatory against people who were not 6 foot plus tall, who were not 250 pounds or more, and very, very muscular. My understanding is that Chris Benoit was using steroids from when he was in high school. In the months before the murders, Chris received a number of text messages from Nancy in which she made it very clear she was sick and tired of his steroid abuse. Nancy definitely directly accused him of abusing steroids to the point that it led him to be an angry and violent and unhappy husband. And she said that the WWE's drug enforcement policy and testing regime was obviously nonsense. Something called the wellness program that alleged that it was testing every WWE wrestler to make sure they weren't using recreational drugs, performance-enhancing drugs or steroids.
I think at that time, you know, instituting a wellness program like that, I think everybody was happy that finally some of these guys that needed the help were going to get help.
He was able to be maneuvered between
help talent,
and it did. His face grimaced a little bit whenever I sprayed him with cold water.
The WWE's drug
And I was like, you know, we might have someone off the airplane in a wheelchair.
Freaking aspirin.
He couldn't really...
Like a high-powered aspirin, unless you had like a prescription. And I'm not kidding. The drug testing is so strict that this rampant steroid use. Dude, you can't. You can't go snort cocaine or smoke weed or anything.
In practice, it was seen that this initial version of the wellness program had large loopholes in it and large blind spots that allowed wrestlers to continue to use drugs at a really large scale without tripping the tests.
And he missed his own mom, and he missed his kids, and he missed his wife. Being on the road 360 days a year, that wears on you.
WWE did everything they could combat any coverage in the news that indicated
so they could sleep, and when they woke up, they'd be in Japan.
The drugs can be seen as a necessary evil.
Like this over 3 days. It's not an act of rage, be it steroid rage or roid rage, whatever it's called, or any other rage.
WWE strongly suggests that it is entirely wrong for speculators to suggest that steroids had anything to do with these senseless acts.
It's all speculation until the toxicology reports come back.
In his autopsy, Chris Benoit was shown to have enormous amounts of testosterone in his body. Testosterone is still a steroid that's banned in all major sports. It directly leads to increased muscle growth. Some folks have said he had 10 times the normal amount of testosterone in his body as a normal human.
And did Benoit pass the wellness program check leading up to the murders?
Yes, preposterously, Chris Benoit passed the wellness checks leading up to the murder, despite the irrefutable fact that he was taking enormous amounts of steroids.
Well, after it initially happened, I actually had nightmares. It was very traumatic because as a female, I tend to really get angry with him The one person she thought was there to protect her is the one that really took her life.
There was a lot of stuff going on behind closed doors that no one knew about. I think there was a lot of volatile fights. One thing I'd always heard about Nancy, and the fact that she didn't take shit. So I just know there was a lot of volatility there. That's the word I think was used, volatile.
There was a few times that Nancy would call me and she would say that her and Chris are fighting. There was an instance when they were in Tampa and Chris was upset when they were driving on the way to our house, and Chris went in and busted the windshield of their car.
Did you ever witness any abuse that was going on in that relationship?
My sister called me to the house, and she called Mike Durham, known as Johnny Grunge, who was also a professional wrestler that lived in the area. And Mike said, I'll go wrangle Chris. I'll go wrangle Chris. Don't do anything rash. But it was already kind of done. He hurt her. I don't know whether it was intentional or accidental, but he hurt her. Out of respect for the kids that he still has here, I won't go further into that. She got a restraining order against him. I went down there and stayed at the house. Mike had him at a hotel there in the area. Chris contacted me directly because Nancy wasn't answering any of his calls and asked me to talk to my sister on his behalf. And please, please, please let him come to the house and talk to her personally. She called him, and he came over the next day, and they were back together a couple of days later. So I look back on that moment and say, you probably shouldn't have gotten involved, and why did I take his call? Because maybe that would have been the end of it. Almost every day I think about that.
When police found steroids on the scene, many assume that explained it. The killer had flipped out because of drug use. Or might there be another explanation?
The initial media coverage all focused on steroid use, and I said, there's no way. I'm Chris Nowinski. I'm a former WWE superstar, and now I am a neuroscientist and run the Concussion Legacy Foundation. My wrestling career came to an end because I had a series of concussions that I didn't quite appreciate were concussions. I never stopped performing until the damage was sort of too much. So I decided I would start digging into what else was known, and it became a book. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, is a progressive degenerative brain disease that appears to be started by hits to the head. What I knew about CTE at that time was that there were 4 cases of NFL players. 2 had died by suicide, and 1 had started hearing voices and led the police on a chase through upstate New York and died in a fiery crash going on the wrong side of the highway. When I heard about what happened with Chris Benoit, I immediately remembered a conversation I'd had with him maybe 6 months prior. I remembered that he had sat next to me in the locker room, and he said, I heard you writing a book about concussions. I was like, yeah. And he goes, I'm interested in what you're learning. And he's like, how many concussions have you had, before you had to retire? And I said, well, I can remember at least 6, but I probably had more. And I said, how many have you had? And he said, I've had more than I can count. And then he said, I'm gonna give you my phone number and I want you to call me next week. The next week I called him. It sounded like he was in the middle of an argument. He was clearly agitated. It sounded like someone else was there. He just said, hey, I can't talk right now, can I call you back? And I said, sure. I wonder if the reason he was asking me to call him was that he knew that something was going on, but he didn't quite appreciate what that was. And so I decided that I really needed to know if Chris had CTE. There was so much media attention, I really couldn't imagine his family answering the phone. But I said, I'll give it a try. And Chris's father answered on the 2nd ring. He was in a state of mind you could imagine when you just lost your son and learned what happened. I told him my theory, and he immediately said, yeah, I want to see this done. We have the brain in early July, and I think within about a month we knew that it was positive for CTE. And it was a pretty severe case of CTE. And so we held a press conference in New York.
When you look at Christopher Benoit's brain, it is in fact shocking. Our findings showed extensive areas of tau protein deposition throughout his brain. Tau protein is a marker for brain damage.
With Chris, he actually had what would be defined as a severe case of CT at 40 years old, which is early to have it. So it wouldn't just be areas of his cortex or areas of his brain stem, but there was damage in areas that you would think could influence emotional behaviors. And I believe the degeneration of his brain changed who he was and what he was capable of. If you get hit in the head thousands of times, your brain essentially can start to rot. You get this damage in your brain that even after you stop getting hit in the head will continue to spread and changes who you are and how you behave and what you become.
I think about, when me and Chris would be talking and he would just be crying so much that, I wonder why he couldn't control his crying. Does that go with the concussions? Does that go with his brain? Eddie and Chris took a lot of chair shots. And these chair shots from years ago were hard and they were mean.
In the 90s, we used to take chair shots to the head. That was a badge of honor. And what I mean by that is someone would swing a steel chair at your head. And I literally remember you would grit your teeth and you'd tense yourself and tense your neck. And just take it. They hit you on the head with it and you just take it. That was what you did. That was expected. If you had a concussion in wrestling, you just shake it off. Shake it off, go in there and do it. And all of us did it.
I wrestled for 20 plus years. It makes me wonder, how much CTE do I have? How much CTE do these other wrestlers have? Because we all got it to some extent, Is this gonna be my end?
So one of the most incredible things to me is you have Harley Race invents the flying headbutt and tells everyone after, don't do this move, it fucks your spine up horribly, it ruins your ability to have an old age. Dynamite Kid hears that from Harley Race, does it his whole career, ends up in a wheelchair. Dynamite Kid tells Chris Benoit does it his whole career, and then loses his mind. I mean, there is a clear history of people repeating the most self-destructive story imaginable over and over again.
I think the Benoit tragedy led to some institutional changes. The awareness of what CTE is was never before even a conversation point. Now it is. And finally, unprotected chair shots and subsequent concussions are now being addressed because the one thing we've got to do is protect the athlete.
I think when you look at what Chris Benoit did as a symptom of some sort of medical problem, whether it's drug use or brain damage, I think that misses the point. Ultimately, this thing that is the core reason this happened was Chris Benoit made a decision when he was a very young person to do absolutely whatever it took to succeed at his childhood dream of becoming a pro wrestling star. No matter what happened that weekend, Chris Benoit's story was going to have a tragic end.
I think his fate was sealed the day that Eddie died, whether he knew it or not. I don't think anybody could save him after that. Not his kids, not his family, not his other friends. I just think that was the one guy that he said, I can't do it if Eddie's not with me. Whatever it was that he was going through, or was in his head that caused him to snap, and he snapped.
It's not one thing. I think that it's a factor of alcohol and drugs and yes, possibly CTE and stress
Light that
and
will
grief.
change his life forever.
Terry's accumulated so many pills
that
I'm having to push him with it. He's dying on me.
I just know that there was something going on with him that wasn't him, and it's something that I'm still very much
Before a
with
flight to
because
Japan.
You love Chris.
Eventually.
You just hate what he did.
The act of what he did is unthinkable, unforgivable. But it's still hard for me to separate a friendship that I had with him, matches that I had with him, moments, times, car rides. I think I can always look at Chris as one of the best performers our business has ever seen. Just gotta leave it at that.
get questioned all the time, does Chris Benoit deserve to be in the Hall of Fame? And I'd say absolutely not. No. The issue is that if Chris were here, we could talk to him, he would say, putting me in the Hall of Fame is going to be one of the great distractions of the entire event. Because all it's going to do is bring up Nancy and Daniel and Chris in their last 24 hours. So therefore I say, Chris Benoit does not belong in the WWE Hall of Fame, now or ever.
You have two guys that were the same basically their whole life and had the same reputation of being just immaculate professionals, immaculate human beings, the nicest guys, and they both die very young, and one's legacy is acclaimed and one's is buried so that you almost can't say his name. If you would have told Chris, you know, when you die, your name and your body of work is gonna be erased from existence forever, it would have broke his heart. Because I think if nothing else, I remember he told me once, like, listen, the critics are the critics, but if you have the respect of your peers, then nothing else matters. So to find out that he would have lost the respect, not only of his peers, his friends, his family, I don't think he ever wanted that. It almost took down the whole business. What Chris did almost, and that's another thing, what Chris did almost destroyed the only thing that he ever loved, from a professional standpoint. The only thing he ever loved, pro wrestling, Chris Benoit almost destroyed it. That would have torn him apart as well. So it leads us around to, like, why did he do it? And I don't think anyone's ever gonna be able to answer that question.
You know, people would look at me different now because of what he did. People talking shit behind my back, looking at me different, getting bullied. Screw it. I'm defending my family and what I believe in. You know, he loved them. That definitely was not him. He's still my hero. I think about him all the time. I want them to recognize Nancy, though. She definitely deserves the recognition that she doesn't get.
That's the unfortunate and the sad part about the story, is that she needs to be remembered for a strong woman pioneering in this business and her talent, and focus on that instead of what happened to her.
She's a Hall of Famer all across the board, in my opinion. She was a pioneer and one of the best at a role that doesn't exist anymore. As a pro wrestling manager, she created the role, she perfected the role, and then when she stopped doing it, the role basically disappeared. I would like nothing better than to see Nancy, Nancy Benoit. Once again, you can't even say that name, right? Woman. I would like nothing better than to see woman be put into the WWE Hall of Fame.
She was a great mom. She was a beautiful friend, and Nancy will always be the superstar that she was meant to be in my mind.
Can I blow a kiss?
What do you remember the most about Nancy?
I remember everything about her. I remember how her hair smells. She used to tuck me in with both hands real hard, like on her both sides of the blanket to tuck me in, almost like she was putting a lock on me to keep me safe. And to this day, when I get sad or upset or stressed out, I will tuck myself in on the sides so that I feel more secure.
What do you remember the most about Daniel?
Everything. I closed my eyes and I could see him doing everything. He was our whole lives, all of us. He was very, 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 very loved by our family, by his siblings. He and his brother were just thick as thieves.
Did you go on to have any relationship with the Benoit family afterward?
I tried. Unsuccessfully. I was told, I won't say by who, that the children didn't want anything to do with us. And apparently the children were told that we didn't want anything to do with them because of what their dad did, which was absolutely not the truth.
My last trip with my family was for WrestleMania 23 in Detroit. And then after the match, we flew back to Atlanta, me, Nancy, and Daniel. My dad went to Mexico for a tour. And then me, Nancy, and Daniel were just hanging around the house, taking pictures, you know, out by the trees with the dogs. And then, you know,
It's all good. Just let it out. That's what this is all about, bud. It's all shit. David is absolutely a victim. He's a great kid that was just dealt a bad hand. And it's just not fair. It's not right. He didn't do anything wrong. He's an innocent bystander in all of this.
It's good for us. It's good for us.
I felt that because Chris killed his family, that the family he left behind was automatically blackballed from the world. Like, they're gonna be blamed for what Chris did. To me, those two needed to be reconnected, because talking with David and meeting Sandra and knowing she was having the same issues and pain and hurt that David had, and nobody will ever really understand what they went through with the exception of each other. So I thought if I could connect them, if they had a chance to talk, that maybe they could move on and still realize that they have family in each other.
Chris Jericho, wrestling angel come to life. He gave my number to my nephew and gave my nephew's number to me. We hadn't talked since before everything happened.
So 13 years the last time we saw each other. It's been a very long time. She finally called me. I answered. We talked on the phone for probably a good 2 hours. And now going to watch wrestling because I still love it. It's in my blood. Feels like we never were apart. Felt like we just reconnected. Left off where we started. Nothing has changed. She's still my Auntie Zaja.
Chris lives on in David every day, and Nancy lives on in Sandra every day. And I think they were both lost when Chris and Nancy died. So hopefully this will help them get found.
We feel better.
Yeah,
Weight's been lifted.
well, because you guys have the same perspective, you know, and it's
I think
important for you
more
guys
than anyone
to
else,
stick
yeah.
together on this, right? Because you know, yeah, like we can be friends and be supportive, but it's not the same. It's for you guys.
No, it's not the same. It's family.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
I've never been more grateful and happy to see someone that I love as I was when I saw my nephew.
Do you think you will ever be able to or want to give forgiveness towards Chris?
Yes, I think I do someday want to be able to forgive him. I do. Because carrying around the burden of hate gets exhausting. Everyone deserves forgiveness. And everyone deserves mercy. So I think that within time, there will be a day when I get on my knees and I finally say it, that I forgive him. You never know, it might be tomorrow, but I do know it's not today.
His family lives with the daily, terrifying uncertainty of how his neurological health will degenerate in the next 10 to 20 years. Foley is well aware of the damage he has inflicted upon himself, acknowledging that there is no magical escape from the consequences of his actions. However, he refuses to surrender to fear in an effort to keep his mind sharp and actively combat cognitive decline. He tours the globe delivering spoken word performances. These shows provide him with essential mental gymnastics forcing his brain to remain active while simultaneously allowing him to continue feeling the intoxicating energy and acceptance of a live audience. He recognizes that he can either live paralyzed by the fear of the unknown, or he can appreciate the life he has built. Colette Foley acknowledges that her husband was always his own worst enemy inside the squared circle. The underlying psychology of professional wrestling is deeply strange. Athletes dress in elaborate costumes and engage in a grueling, physically destructive form of simulated combat, frequently leaving the arena in far worse condition than they arrived, all to earn the fleeting acceptance of total strangers. For Foley, it was always about the reaction. It was about seeing the audience's eyes light up. It was driven by a desperate, profound need to be authentically loved by the masses. He sacrificed his physical well-being entirely for the roar of the crowd. One cannot criticize this inherent fault without simultaneously acknowledging that it is the exact engine that drove his massive success. Mick Foley is a celebrated author, a multi-time world champion, and a dedicated philanthropist. Yet, for many years, he harbored a deep resentment toward the Hell in a cell match. Frustrated that society seemingly only remembered him for that one night of catastrophic violence, this resentment plunged him into a dark psychological space, leaving him feeling as though, despite his legendary career, he had accomplished nothing of substance. It was a poignant conversation with The Undertaker that finally provided clarity. The Undertaker reminded him that what they created together that night in Pittsburgh would outlive them both. That realization allowed Foley to finally embrace his legacy. He entered the professional wrestling industry to create indelible moments, and he achieved exactly that. History will remember Mick Foley as a man who quite literally gave his blood, his sweat, and his neurological health to the business of professional wrestling. The audience tunes in hoping to experience genuine awe, an emotion rarely provoked in modern society. Foley possessed a rare, dangerous gift to consistently put millions of people in a state of absolute awe. The profound weight of this legacy was crystallized during a visit to the corporate warehouse. Foley, accompanied by his daughter Noelle, unexpectedly encountered the original cell structure. Upon touching the cold steel that had nearly claimed his life, the hardcore legend broke down in tears. For a man who built a career on ignoring pain, this display of raw emotion highlighted the terrifying reality of what he survived. He realized how terrifyingly close he came to losing everything. In retrospect, there is arguably no financial reward substantial enough to justify the risks taken on June 28, 1998. The industry's understanding of head trauma and long-term injuries was severely lacking during that era. Yet, even armed with modern medical knowledge, Foley remains uncertain if he would have altered his path. He viewed the wrestling ring as a violent canvas, a platform that allowed him to create a brand of surreal, sublime performance art that captivated the globe. Despite the severe bumps in the road and the lasting scars he carries, he ultimately views his journey as a magical existence. On the nights when the story culminated perfectly, when the crowd erupted in genuine shock and adoration, Mick Foley experienced one of the most uniquely powerful feelings known to humanity. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. We gather here to look back at the annals of professional wrestling, to peel back the curtain on an industry built on the grand illusion of combat, and to examine those rare, terrifying moments when the illusion shatters, leaving only raw, visceral reality. I have sat ringside for decades. I have called matches for the World Wrestling Federation, World Championship Wrestling, Extreme Championship Wrestling, and beyond. I have seen the greatest triumphs and the most agonizing tragedies the sport has to offer. But today, we are diving deep into the shadows. We are opening the files of the dark side of the ring to analyze a night that permanently altered the landscape of sports entertainment. The date was June 28, 1998. The event was the King of the Ring pay-per-view, held inside the cavernous walls of the Pittsburgh Civic Arena. The match was billed as Hell in a Cell. The combatants, The Undertaker and Mankind. To understand the magnitude of this event, you must understand the psychology of the men involved. Professional wrestling is often dismissed by critics as a fabricated spectacle. They say it is fake. But let me tell you something, ladies and gentlemen. You cannot fake gravity. You cannot fake the sickening thud of human flesh meeting unforgiving concrete. On that night in Pittsburgh, the pain was absolute. The drama was unfiltered. The collateral damage was terrifying. It was a dangerously crazy masterpiece. But as we look back, we must ask a heavy question. Was it worth it? To answer that, we have to look at the man behind the leather mask of mankind. His real name is Mick Foley, according to his own admissions. Mick was a young man searching for something missing in his own life. He was teased. He harbored an overwhelming need to be liked, to be accepted. He tells a story from his sophomore year of college that perfectly encapsulates his mindset. He took a swig of red food coloring, climbed onto a bed, and delivered a high-flying leap onto a stuffed atom resting on a concrete floor. When he hit the ground, he spat out the red concoction in front of his dorm mates. He remembers a girl yelling that it was the most disgusting thing she had ever seen. In that moment, Mick Foley felt power. He realized that if he could not make people love him, perhaps he could command their attention by disgusting them. He needed to get reactions. This need would become the driving force of his entire existence. Colette Foley, his wife of over 35 years, remembers the man behind the madness. She saw his gentle eyes, his corny jokes, his terrible humor. Their wedding song was Beauty and the Beast, a fitting metaphor for the life they would build together. But Colette also understood his relentless commitment to his craft. When the adrenaline was pumping, Mick wanted nothing more than for the audience to leave talking about how great the show was, even if it meant putting his own life at immense risk. This drive took him across the globe, according to the records of his early career. His bedroom furniture consisted of a mattress on the floor, accompanied by a black and white television and a videocassette recorder that barely worked. On that screen, he consumed up to 12 hours of Japanese wrestling a day. He was captivated by the realism, the storytelling, the concept of not just fighting another man, but defeating the very surroundings. He adopted the persona of Cactus Jack, a wild, unpredictable character who commanded attention. In Japan, the promoters were looking for a foreigner who could feud with the legendary Terry Funk. Terry Funk was a master of craft, a man who could make audiences suspend their disbelief in an instant. Funk became a mentor to Foley, and together, they waged war in explosive, bloody death matches. We are talking about barbed wire. We are talking about taking falls directly on concrete. We are talking about arenas in Japan where wrestlers were subjected to the blast of composition for explosives. For Mick Foley, realism was his greatest tool. He did not believe he had a good match unless he struggled to walk back to his hotel room. He did not enjoy the pain, but he reveled in his ability to endure it and sell it to the audience. He was willing to sacrifice his body for the roar of the crowd. However, the World Wrestling Federation in the early 1990s was a different landscape. It was a general audience's era, a sanitized environment that did not immediately embrace a competitor like Mick Foley. According to legendary executive and commentator Jim Ross, the chairman of the company, Vince McMahon, had zero interest in Foley. McMahon did not think Foley was marketable. He did not think he had the look of a superstar. But Jim Ross saw something in him. Ross needed a dancing partner for his top star, The Undertaker. The company had spent years feeding massive giants to The Undertaker, and the formula had grown stale. Ross knew that to push The Undertaker to his limits, they did not need another giant. They needed a lunatic. McMahon finally relented, slamming his hand on a table and agreeing to bring Foley in, but with a strict condition: they would cover his face. McMahon wanted to erase Foley's past, stripping away his previous identities to create something entirely new. Hall of Famer Gerald Briscoe recalled the immense challenge of building a character out of nothing. The result was Mankind, a tortured, deranged soul who wore a terrifying leather mask and literally pulled his own hair out in frustration. This concept could have been a disastrous failure in the hands of an ordinary man. But Mick Foley was no ordinary man. He poured his heart and soul into the character, utilizing profound psychological manipulation to connect with the audience. He knew fans were drawn to someone who appeared completely out of control, someone who shattered the unwritten rules of the script. By 1998, Mankind and The Undertaker had laid an incredible foundation. They had battled in 7 pay-per-view matches and 10 television matches all over the globe. But Foley felt his character had plateaued. He needed a spark. He needed to do something that would elevate their legacy. The stage was set for King of the Ring. The company decided to resurrect the Hell in a cell match. For those unfamiliar, traditional cage matches require a competitor to climb over the walls or walk out the door. The Hell in a Cell was a different beast entirely. It was an enclosed structure with a roof, designed so that 2 men would enter and only one would leave. The very first Hell in a Cell featured Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker, and it was a masterpiece. It was a flawless athletic display that set an impossibly high standard. Foley watched that first match with his jaw open, knowing he could not physically replicate the athletic feats of Shawn Michaels. He was not the most nimble athlete. He needed a different approach. According to Foley himself, he sought advice from his mentor, Terry Funk. During a casual conversation, Funk jokingly suggested that they start the match on top of the cage, and that Foley should be thrown off. Funk laughed, but Foley stopped him. The gears in his mind began to turn. Foley looked at his mentor and said that he believed he could actually do it. He could not get the idea out of his head. Foley approached Vince McMahon and The Undertaker with the pitch. Undertaker was hesitant. He did not want to throw his colleague off the top of a steel structure, but Foley was dead set on the idea. He was not viewing this match as the beginning of a second act in his career. He genuinely believed his time was coming to an end, and he was just trying to keep his head above water. If he could see the stunt in his mind, he believed he could execute it. He convinced them. The atmosphere inside the Pittsburgh Civic Arena was electric. 16,000 fans packed the building. The pressure on Foley was astronomical. The legendary Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler were at the commentary desk, completely in the dark about what was truly planned. Jimmy Corderas, a veteran referee and ring crew member, was stationed backstage, sitting in the captain's seat in front of 10 monitors, watching production unfold. When Mankind's music hit, the audience braced for violence. But then, Foley did the unthinkable. Before The Undertaker even made his entrance, Mankind began to scale the outside of the steel structure. There was a collective gasp, a shock that rippled through the arena and the locker room. The commentators were bewildered. Was he daring The Undertaker to start the match on the roof? Foley had assured his colleagues that he was comfortable up there, but the terrifying truth was that he was deathly afraid of heights. As he stood atop that monstrous cell, engulfed in the darkness of the arena rafters, he wondered how he could gracefully climb down without ruining his career. Then, the iconic toll of the bell echoed to the arena. The Undertaker made his way to the ring and climbed the cell to meet his adversary. The Hell in a Cell match was officially underway. Almost immediately, disaster threatened to strike. The roof of the cell was constructed of steel mesh panels fastened with industrial zip ties. When you put 600 pounds of massive human beings on top of that mesh, the physics become terrifying. With every step they took, the fencing dipped nearly a full foot. Backstage, producers could hear the sickening sound of zip ties snapping under the immense pressure. They were literally destroying the structure just by walking on it. Foley attempted to suplex The Undertaker on the unstable roof, but The Undertaker cut him off. Acutely aware that the mesh was on the verge of collapsing beneath them, they began trading blows, inching closer and closer to the precipice of the cell, right above the Spanish announce desk. Backstage, veteran producers held their breath. They thought it was too dangerous, too unpredictable. The margin for error was non-existent. From Foley's perspective, looking down from almost 20 feet in the air, the announce table looked like a piece of dollhouse furniture. Then it happened. The Undertaker grabbed Mankind, lifted the 300-pound man into the air, and hurled him off the edge of the cell. To the viewers at home, time seemed to stand still, yet the moment was over in the blink of an eye. Mankind plummeted through the air and crashed violently through the Spanish announce desk. The impact was deafening. Hugo Savinovic, the Spanish commentator, narrowly dove out of the way to avoid being flattened. At the commentary desk, Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler watched in absolute horror. The locker room erupted in sheer panic. It was like witnessing a horrific automobile accident. Many of his peers genuinely thought Mick Foley was dead. Despite the sheer terror of the moment, the execution was a testament to Foley's bizarre brilliance. In mid-air, he managed to rotate his body just enough to land flat on the desk, allowing the structure to absorb a fraction of the impact and cushion the fall. Had The Undertaker thrown him a fraction of an inch too far or too short, Foley would have hit the unyielding concrete floor, or worse, landed directly on the fans. Chaos reigned at ringside. Terry Funk was the first man out of the back, sprinting to the wreckage to check if his friend was conscious. The medical personnel rushed to the scene. Enter Dr. Francois Petit, a man described by his peers as a human Swiss Army knife, a martial arts expert, a man of many talents, and the trusted physician for the superstars. Dr. Petit arrived to find Foley in catastrophic condition, having landed horribly on his back and on a dislocated shoulder. The emergency medical technicians brought out a gurney, treating the situation as a legitimate medical emergency. They strapped Foley down to transport him to the hospital. To the audience, to the commentators, and to the executives in the back, the match was over. It had to be over. But then an unbelievable shift occurred. As Foley lay strapped to the gurney, the fog in his mind began to clear. He realized that the longer the delay went on, the more the audience became fully invested. Fueled by adrenaline and an unbreakable commitment to his craft, Foley made a decision that defied all logic. He rolled off the gurney. He pushed past the medical personnel, and he began to walk back toward the structure. His colleagues pleaded with him. They screamed at him to stop, to stay down, to go to the back. They thought he was an absolute madman, but Foley ignored them. He began to climb the cell for a second time. Backstage, Jimmy Corderas watched the monitors, knowing that another planned moment was approaching. The storyline dictated that Foley would take a choke slam on top of the cell, causing the mesh to gradually give way so the Undertaker could stuff him down into the ring. It was supposed to be a controlled visual spectacle. But as the saying goes, no plan survives contact with the enemy. Atop the broken cage, the Undertaker grabbed Mankind by the throat and lifted him for the choke slam. He drove him down into the steel mesh. But the panels did not just give way. They completely failed. The roof tore open, and Mick Foley plummeted like a stone, free falling into the ring below. This was not a cushion landing. He hit the ring mat, which is essentially a thin layer of padding over solid wood and steel beams. It is as unforgiving as cement, and to make matters infinitely worse, a heavy, solid steel folding chair that had been resting on the roof fell through the hole right behind him. As Foley violently impacted the mat, the steel chair crashed directly onto his face. The silence that fell over the backstage area was suffocating. This was not planned. This was an unmitigated disaster. Even the most hardened veterans of the industry thought they had just watched a man lose his life. Colette Foley, watching at home with her young children, was paralyzed with fear. She had previously assured her children that their father was just acting. But in that horrifying moment, the line between fiction and terrifying fact was obliterated. She felt a surge of furious betrayal, believing her husband had lied to her about the risks he was taking. In the ring, Foley lay completely motionless. For the first time in his legendary, brutal career, he had been legitimately knocked unconscious. The Undertaker, looking down to the hole in the roof, realized the catastrophic severity of the situation. He stared at Terry Funk, who had rushed into the ring, and quietly instructed him to see if Foley was even breathing. Funk checked on his friend and reported back that there was breath in his lungs, but Foley's eyes were vacant. Nobody was home. In a desperate bid to buy time for the medical staff, Terry Funk turned to The Undertaker and told him to attack him. It was a completely unscripted, impromptu decision designed to draw the camera's focus away from Foley's lifeless body. In any modern context, the match would have been stopped immediately. But the industry was different then. They did not stop matches. They bought time. For 42 agonizing seconds, Mick Foley remained unconscious. When he finally opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was the shoes of Terry Funk. Slowly, the realization washed over him. He was in the middle of a match, and then he did the impossible. He stood up. How a human being could stand after enduring such trauma is a question that defies medical science. He was a battered, broken mess. He had a massive wound underneath his lip. His jaw was dislocated. But even in his heavily concussed state, Foley's mind went straight to performance. Realizing he had a gaping hole in his face, he purposely stuck his tongue through the wound beneath his lip, creating an absolutely gruesome visual for the television cameras. And then the audience saw it. A tooth violently dislodged by the steel chair had somehow been forced up into his nasal passage and was protruding from his nostril. The doctors later theorized that he had inhaled the tooth into his throat, and his heavy, desperate breathing had forced it up into his nasal cavity. Yet, through the blood and the sheer agony, Mick Foley smiled. The pain was incredibly real. The expressions of deep concern on the faces of the officials were genuine. Foley turned to the referee and demanded that they retrieve a bag of thumbtacks. The match had to have a finish. Thousands of sharp metal tacks were scattered across the ring canvas. Foley engaged The Undertaker once more, culminating in Foley being slammed directly into the bed of tacks. Driven by pure instinct and an inhuman threshold for pain, Foley purposely rolled his body across the mat to ensure he was covered in as many tacks as possible. He wanted the visual. He wanted to over-deliver. Finally, mercifully, after 17 agonizing minutes, The Undertaker secured the victory, ending what is widely considered the most unbelievable spectacle in the history of the sport. The 16,000 fans in the arena erupted in a mix of awe and sheer relief. The medical staff rushed the ring with a stretcher, but Foley, ever performer, waved them off and walked out on his own 2 feet, cementing an unbreakable bond with the audience. They knew what they had witnessed was as real as a heart attack. They knew this man had literally laid his life on the line for their entertainment. As Foley stumbled to the curtain to the backstage area, he was swarmed by his incredibly relieved peers. Vince McMahon approached him, looked him in the eye, and thanked him for what he had done for the company. But McMahon immediately followed it with stern, unequivocal demand. Foley was to promise never do anything like that again. Meanwhile, in his concussed state, Foley casually asked The Undertaker if they had remembered to do the sequence with the thumbtacks, completely unaware that the medical staff was currently pulling dozens of them out of his flesh. When he finally called his wife, Colette was frantic. The delay in hearing from him had caused her immense anxiety. She screamed through the phone that their children thought he was dead. The Hell in a Cell match fundamentally changed the dynamic of his family. The implicit trust that he would not jeopardize his life was shattered. From that night forward, every time he stepped into the ring, profound fear accompanied him. The physical toll that night was staggering. Foley suffered a heavily bruised kidney that lingered for 6 weeks. He required 15 stitches beneath his lip. He lost 2 teeth. His jaw was dislocated, as was his shoulder. The long-term trauma to his brain from concussions was unquantifiable. Yet, professionally, the match catalyzed a massive renaissance for his career in a span of 6 months. Mick Foley went from a man Vince McMahon did not want on his television programs to the world champion of the company. The fans worshipped him, but success is a double-edged sword. The applause, the adrenaline, the absolute roar of the crowd. It became an addiction. The bar for violence had been set impossibly high, and Foley felt an overwhelming pressure to constantly live up to his moniker as the hardcore legend. Jim Ross issued a stark warning. If Foley continued to push the boundaries of human endurance, it would eventually catch up with him. Foley heard the words, but he refused to accept them. Just 7 months after the horrors of hell in a cell, Foley found himself in an I Quit match against The Rock. It was another brutally violent affair. The script called for Foley to be handcuffed, rendering him defenseless. While The Rock struck him in the head with a steel chair, they had agreed on 5 strikes. But in the heat of the moment, the adrenaline took over. Foley, heavily invested in making the sequence look as devastating as possible, encouraged his opponent to lay in the strikes. Instead of 5 chair shots, McFoley endured 11 horrific, unprotected blows to the head with solid steel. Watching from the front row were Colette Foley and their 2 young children. It was, in Colette's words, one of the worst days of her life. The children were forced to watch their father be mercilessly battered, sobbing uncontrollably. The fiction of the storyline had collided violently with the devastating reality of brain trauma. His daughter, Noelle, reflecting on the incident years later, admitted she has almost no memories of her father wrestling, believing her mind blocked out the profound trauma. To subject a human being to 11 blunt force impacts to the skull is sickening. A normal person could have died in that ring. Foley later admitted he hated the I Quit match. He recognized that there were countless times throughout his career where he could have protected himself, where he could have mitigated the pain. But he chose not to because he believed the suffering made the performance look better. He was locked in a cycle of sacrificing his well-being for the roar of the audience. Eventually, the bill comes due. Medical professionals urge him to stop. A leading neurologist evaluated Foley and delivered a chilling verdict. He advised Foley to never wrestle again, warning him that if he continued, he would end up crippled. The human brain is not designed to withstand repeated collisions akin to a 25-mile-per-hour car crash. Today, the shadow of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, commonly known as CTE, looms large over the Foley family. It is a terrifying degenerative disease caused by repetitive brain trauma. The long-term effects are unknown. Foley's loved ones live with the constant, agonizing worry of what his cognitive health will look like in 10 or 20 years. He has experienced severe memory issues, recalling times when he would drive through his own neighborhood and forget where he lived. Concussion upon concussion has left an indelible mark on his neurological system. Yet, true to his nature, Mick Foley refuses to surrender to fear. He actively fights the cognitive decline. He tours the world performing spoken word shows, engages his mind, and interacted with the fans. He treats these performances as mental gymnastics, fighting to stay sharp as he ages. The roar of the crowd, the validation, the love, it still fuels him. He has made peace with his choices. He acknowledges that you cannot criticize his faults without also recognizing that those very faults are responsible for his legendary success. For many years, Foley harbored deep resentment toward the Hell in a cell match. It was a dark period in his life. He felt that despite all his charity work, his multiple championships, and his diverse career, he was only remembered for being thrown off a steel roof. He felt reduced to a single violent stunt. But time brings perspective. During a quiet conversation, The Undertaker looked at him and said that what they created that night in Pittsburgh outlived them both. That realization allowed Foley to finally embrace his legacy. He had entered the wrestling business to create indelible moments, to leave an audience in absolute awe. And on that fateful night, he accomplished exactly that. Recently, Mick and his daughter Noelle visited the company's vast storage warehouse. Hidden among the relics of wrestling history, they found the original panels of the Hell in a cell structure. Foley walked up to the rusted steel. He reached out and touched the mesh. And right there, in the quiet of the warehouse, the hardcore legend began to weep. His daughter watched in amazement. She had never seen her father cry. The immense gravity of what he had survived, the profound realization of how close he had come to losing everything, finally washed over him. He knows he is incredibly lucky to still be breathing. He admits that there is no financial or professional reward substantial enough to justify the risks he took. If he possessed the medical knowledge back then that we have now regarding head injuries, things might have been different. But he viewed the squared circle as a blank canvas, an arena to create a surreal, terrifying, and sublime form of performance art. It was a magical, beautiful, and deeply dangerous way to make a living. And on the nights when the connection with the crowd was perfect, when the illusion and the reality blurred into one spectacular moment, Mick Foley felt the most powerful feeling in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been an examination of the Hell in a Cell, a testament to human endurance, a cautionary tale of ambition, and a permanent scar on the history of professional wrestling. Thank you for joining us. Step back in time to June 28th, 1998. The setting is the Pittsburgh Civic Arena. The event is the World Wrestling Federation's King of the Ring pay-per-view. On this humid summer evening, 16,000 fans packed the arena, unaware that they were about to witness a spectacle that would forever alter the landscape of professional wrestling. One match would earn its place as the most shocking physical endurance test in the history of the industry. The competitors were two titans of the ring, The Undertaker and Mankind. The battleground was a monstrous steel structure known as Hell in a Cell. When you hear the words Hell in a Cell, the reality of it hits you like a mallet to the consciousness. As recounted by those who were there, everyone knew it was going to be an intense confrontation, but no one could have predicted the absolute chaos that was about to unfold. You had two talents out there who liked to push the envelope until it simply fell over the edge. According to the veterans of the locker room, professional wrestling is scripted, but you absolutely cannot fake gravity. Many seasoned professionals have stated that they have been frightened by numerous things in the wrestling business over the decades. But nothing frightened them quite as much as the events of that night. What left fans completely stunned was the unrelenting, horrifying punishment that Mick Foley, performing under Mask of Mankind, willingly endured until you saw it with your own eyes. You simply did not believe that a human being could physically sustain such trauma and live to tell the tale. This match was real. The pain was real. The drama was profoundly real. Backstage, agents and producers were cursing, screaming, and questioning why any competitor would push their body to such an extreme limit. Today, this confrontation persists as one of wrestling's most infamous matches. Its legacy is twofold. It stands as an epic success in terms of audience captivation, but it also serves as a harrowing cautionary tale. Looking back, industry insiders firmly believe that they dodged several bullets that day. It is truly astonishing to consider that a competitor will be allowed to lose consciousness in the middle of a ring, only for the match to continue. The collateral damage that ensued from these decisions is an entirely different story. It forces us to ask the hard questions. When does it stop? When is it enough? You pay all day long for the decisions you make during your 15 minutes in the spotlight. It was a dangerously crazy masterpiece, but everyone who witnessed it must ask themselves, was the physical toll truly worth the glory? To understand the sheer madness of that night, we must first analyze the psychology of the man behind the mask. According to Mick Foley himself, everyone who steps into the wrestling ring is searching for something they find missing in their own personal lives. Growing up, Foley was teased relentlessly, which fostered an overwhelming need to be liked and accepted. He desperately wanted to hold the World Wrestling Federation Championship belt, but his path to that goal was highly unconventional. As a college sophomore, Foley discovered a bizarre method to command attention. He recounted a specific incident where he took a swig of red food coloring and performed a flying leap off a bed, landing on a stuffed atom position on a solid concrete floor. When he hit the concrete, he spat out the blood-like concoction. The entire dormitory was watching. When one of the female students yelled out that it was the most disgusting thing she had ever seen, Foley did not feel shame. Instead, he felt power. He reasoned that if he could not make people love him, perhaps he could disgust them. He simply needed to evoke a reaction. Thus began the journey of the man who would become the hardcore legend, the man who would eventually survive Hell in a Cell. Hell in a Cell serves as the perfect gateway into the extreme world of Mick Foley. Countless fans point to that specific match as their introduction to the sport. However, as his daughter Noelle Foley notes, new viewers are often shocked to learn that not all wrestling matches are that violent. A standard Mick Foley match was a theater of brutality, frequently involving blood, thumbtacks, and fire. according to historical footage and family accounts. His career involved being wrapped in barbed wire, being caught in explosives in Japan, getting speared through flaming tables, and taking agonizing falls directly onto concrete floors. He put his physical body through an unimaginable amount of trauma, driven by an insatiable desire to hear the crowd gasp in shock and awe. Realism was his ultimate tool. Foley did not believe he had delivered a good performance unless he struggled to walk back to his hotel room. According to his own admissions, he did not enjoy the physical agony, but he took immense pride in his ability to endure it and present it to the audience in an entertaining manner. But behind this gladiator was a deeply gentle soul. Colette Foley, who has known Mick for over 35 years, saw past the violence. When they first met, she noticed his kind eyes and his gentle nature. It was his terrible humor and corny jokes that won her heart. And the two even chose a theme from Beauty and the Beast as their wedding song. They were a unified team. Colette understood his relentless commitment to his craft. When the adrenaline was pumping, Foley's only goal was to ensure the audience left talking about the greatness of the show, even if it came at his own extreme personal risk. To stand out, Foley developed an unhinged persona named Cactus Jack. He portrayed a wild, unpredictable individual who captivated audiences with sheer charisma and a terrifying willingness to absorb pain. Jim Cornette, who worked as an agent and producer for the World Wrestling Federation during this era, noted that Foley possessed an incredible grasp of match psychology. He recognized that audiences craved a performer who appeared completely out of control, someone who defied the standard script. Foley could take the crowd on an emotional roller coaster, deliberately eliciting the exact reactions he desired. As his reputation for wild brawls grew, so did his notoriety. Foley's dedication to the craft bordered on obsession. His early living conditions consisted of a mattress on the floor and a black and white television, connected to a videocassette recorder that barely functioned. On that machine, he would watch up to 12 hours of Japanese wrestling tapes every single day. He was drawn to the storytelling and the brutal realism, where competitors had to defeat not only their opponents, but also their harsh surroundings. Believing his style was best suited for overseas audiences, he transitioned to Japan, where promoters were seeking a foreign competitor to feud with the legendary Terry Funk. Funk, renowned for his ability to make audiences suspend their disbelief, became a mentor to Foley. Together, they engaged in a series of explosive, bloody, and fiery death matches. Foley actively sought out the most dangerous scenarios, believing that crawling on his hands and knees in agony was proof that he had achieved something truly special. Because of this extreme style, Foley never envisioned himself as a star in the World Wrestling Federation. At that time, the promotion was operating in a general audience era, presenting a polished, family-friendly product that starkly contrasted with Foley's gritty, violent nature. Al Snow, a former competitor and Foley's closest travel partner, observed that the chairman of the company, Vince McMahon, initially had zero interest in hiring Foley. McMahon did not view him as marketable or visually appealing. It took the persistent lobbying of talent relations executive Jim Ross to secure Foley an opportunity. Ross pleaded with McMahon to trust his eye for talent. McMahon ultimately relented, but with a strict condition: they had to cover Foley's face, masking his true identity, because McMahon perceived him as a nobody. This mandate birthed the character of Mankind. According to Hall of Fame producer Jerry Briscoe, the creative team was tasked with building a captivating persona out of nothing. They handed Foley a terrifying leather mask and a deranged psychological profile. This bizarre concept would have failed miserably with almost any other performer, but Foley's absolute commitment made it work. He ripped out his own hair and rocked back and forth, forging a deeply unsettling connection with the audience. The ultimate goal behind bringing Foley into the company was to provide a fresh, compelling opponent for The Undertaker, who was arguably the biggest attraction in wrestling history. Management had previously relied on giant, lumbering opponents to face The Undertaker, a strategy that had become stale. What The Undertaker truly needed was an erratic, fearless antagonist. Foley fit that description perfectly. He was willing to try anything and feared nothing. Management's new challenge was simply try and prevent Foley from destroying himself in the process. Over time, Foley and The Undertaker built a legendary rivalry, engaging in 7 pay-per-view matches and 10 television matches across the globe. However, by the summer of 1998, Foley felt his character had hit a plateau. He desperately needed a monumental moment to elevate his legacy. The producers decided to reignite the feud using a recently developed match concept, Hell in a Cell. Traditionally, steel cage matches require a competitor to escape by climbing over the top or walking through a door. The Hell in a Cell concept revolutionized this by adding a solid roof. Once the competitors were inside, there was no escape. Only one man would emerge victorious. The Undertaker and Shawn Michaels had competed in the inaugural Hell in a Cell match months prior, creating a masterpiece that many insiders still consider the greatest of its kind. Foley watched that first match in absolute awe, recognizing that he lacked the athletic agility to replicate what Michaels had done. Knowing he had to offer something entirely different, Foley consulted his mentor, Terry Funk. During a brainstorming session, Funk jokingly suggested that they start the match on top of the cage and that Foley should allow himself to be thrown off. What started as a dark joke took root in Foley's mind. He looked at Funk and seriously declared that he could do it. The idea consumed him. Foley eventually pitched the dangerous stunt to The Undertaker and Vince McMahon, casually slipping it into conversation as a sales pitch. The Undertaker was extremely hesitant, not wanting to throw a man off a massive steel structure. Foley, however, was resolute. He convinced management that it was a safe, manageable risk. Foley viewed this extreme measure not as an attempt to spark a new chapter in his career, but simply as a desperate bid to keep his head above water. He genuinely believed his career was nearing its end. The Undertaker trusted Foley's spatial awareness, operating under the belief that if Foley could visualize a stunt, he could safely execute it. And so, the stage was set. As the match approached, commentators Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler hyped the unprecedented stakes, warning the audience that the loser might bypass the hospital and go straight to the morgue. When the night arrived, the atmosphere in Pittsburgh was electric. Backstage, the crew watched the monitors with bated breath. Jimmy Corderas, a referee and ring crew member, recalled the intense pressure. Jerry Briscoe sat at the production helm, orchestrating the broadcast. No one in the building, including the commentators, fully understood what was about to happen. As Foley made his entrance, he defied all logic and expectation by completely bypassing the cell door. Instead, he began scaling the outside of the enormous steel structure. The crowd buzzed with confusion and awe. The commentators speculated whether he was daring The Undertaker to start the match on the roof. Foley had assured management that he was comfortable with heights, but as he reached the top, the terrifying reality set in. The roof was secured only by plastic zip ties. When the 300-pound Undertaker joined the 300-pound Foley on top, the combined 600 pounds of human weight caused the chain-link mesh to sag drastically. With every step, the zip ties began to snap loudly. The structure was literally breaking beneath their feet. Foley attempted a wrestling maneuver, hoping to slam The Undertaker onto the mesh, but The Undertaker quickly reversed it. Acutely aware that the ceiling was on the verge of collapsing, the two men brawled precariously close to the edge of the cage, towering nearly 20 feet above the Spanish commentator's table. Backstage personnel watched in horror, praying that Foley would not take the plunge. The margin for error was virtually non-existent. The table below looked like miniature dollhouse furniture. Then the unthinkable happened. In a moment that suspended time, The Undertaker grabbed Foley and hurled his massive body off the edge of the cell. Foley plummeted freely through the air, crashing violently through the Spanish announce table. The impact generated an echoing, sickening thud that silenced the breath of everyone watching. Commentator Jim Ross screamed in genuine terror, questioning if they had just witnessed a tragedy. The backstage area erupted in sheer panic. It was described as being akin to witnessing a horrific automobile accident. For a terrifying moment, many believed Mick Foley was dead. In an industry built on controlled illusions, this was a moment of uncontrolled, terrifying reality. Colette Foley, watching at home with their 2 young children, frantically tried to soothe them by claiming it was all special effects, even as her own mind raced with dread. The danger was profound. If The Undertaker had thrown Foley a fraction of an inch too far or too short, Foley would have missed the table entirely, hitting the solid concrete floor or landing on innocent spectators. Miraculously, Foley had visualized the fall perfectly. In midair, he rotated his body to land flat on his back, using the desk to absorb the catastrophic impact. Spanish commentator Hugo Savanovic had barely managed to dive out of the way before the table splintered into pieces. As Foley lay motionless among the wreckage, the arena fell into a stunned silence. Medical personnel, referees, and Terry Funk rushed to his aid. Dr. Francois Petit, a highly skilled physician and martial artist employed by the company, sprinted from the medical room to the ringside area. Foley had landed terribly on his back, aggravating a dislocated shoulder. Emergency medical technicians brought out a gurney, but the massive steel cell obstructed their path. The cell had to be mechanically raised just to extract Foley. As they strapped him to the board, everyone believed the match was mercifully over. But as the gurney rolled up the entrance ramp, Foley's adrenaline-soaked brain processed the situation. He realized that his continued presence in the arena was holding the audience in a state of absolute hypnosis. Against the frantic pleas of the medical staff and officials, Foley rolled off the gurney, smiling through immense pain. He limped back toward the ring and began climbing the towering steel structure for a second time. The audience and the commentators were utterly bewildered. How was this man still standing? Why was he subjecting himself to more torture? Yet, it was this exact moment of incomprehensible resilience that cemented Foley as an immortal star in the eyes of the fans. Back on top of the cell, Foley and The Undertaker prepared for the next sequence. The original plan called for a choke slam, which was supposed to cause a section of the mesh to safely sag, creating a dramatic visual of The Undertaker looming over a trapped Foley. However, the structural integrity of the cage had already been severely compromised. When The Undertaker executed the maneuver, the zip ties failed completely. The steel panel gave way, and Foley plummeted straight through the roof, plummeting roughly 15 feet and crashing violently onto the solid wooden ring canvas. This fall was entirely unplanned and infinitely more dangerous. The ring mat offered virtually no cushion. It was akin to landing on solid cement, to make matters catastrophically worse. A heavy steel folding chair that had been on the roof fell directly behind Foley, striking him violently in the face upon impact. Backstage, panic turned to absolute terror. Colette Foley was screaming at her television set, desperately trying to contact the company, but all lines were engaged. Observers genuinely thought the impact had killed him. It was the first time in his career that Mick Foley had been legitimately knocked unconscious. The cell was immediately flooded with personnel. Dr. Petit and Terry Funk rushed into the ring. The Undertaker stared down through the gaping hole in the roof, visibly shaken, and instructed Funk to check if Foley was still breathing. Funk approached Foley, whose eyes were glazed and unresponsive. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Funk bravely initiated a physical altercation with The Undertaker, attempting to draw the camera's focus away from the stricken Foley and buy the medical team precious time. For 42 seconds, Foley was completely lost to the world. When his consciousness finally began to slowly return, the first thing he saw was Terry Funk's shoes. Disoriented but driven by an unfathomable dedication to performance, Foley willed himself to stand. His physical condition was gruesome. The steel chair had knocked 2 of his teeth out, and the heavy impact had forced one of those teeth upward, lodging it grotesquely into his nasal passage. He had a massive, gaping wound underneath his lip. Yet, as the mental fog began to clear, his first thought was not of medical attention, but creating a memorable television moment. He deliberately pushed his tongue to the horrific hole in his lip and smiled for the cameras. The match continued. In a display of sheer madness, Foley introduced thousands of sharp metal thumbtacks into the ring, purposely throwing his battered body onto them to ensure the audience received the spectacle they desired. Because of the massive adrenaline dump, Foley could no longer feel the physical pain. He had become one with it. Finally, after 17 minutes of relentless brutality, The Undertaker delivered the final blow, securing the victory. The 16,000 fans in attendance erupted in a mixture of awe and relief. When the medical team brought the stretcher out a second time, Foley waved it off, opting to walk out on his own 2 feet. This refusal to surrender solidified an unbreakable emotional bond between Foley and the audience. He understood that by risking his own physical well-being, he allowed the fans to completely invest their belief in him. But the aftermath was severe. Foley's family had spent hours in agonized suspense. When Foley finally called his wife, she was furious, crying out that their children thought their father had died. From that day forward, her anxiety regarding his career skyrocketed. Behind the curtain, Vince McMahon pulled Foley aside, thanking him for everything he had done for the company, but sternly demanding that Foley promise never to attempt anything so reckless ever again. Foley was broken. He had sustained a dislocated jaw, a dislocated shoulder, a severely bruised kidney, a massive concussion, lost multiple teeth, and required 15 stitches just below his lip. Yet, the sacrifice completely changed the trajectory of his career. 6 months later, the man who was once deemed unmarketable was crowned the world champion. However, the insatiable need to overdeliver continued to haunt him. The bar for violence had been set impossibly high. Just 7 months later, Foley pushed his physical limits once again in a brutal encounter against The Rock, known as the I Quit match. In this grueling contest, Foley instructed his opponent not to hold back. He was subjected to a barrage of unprotected strikes to the head with a solid steel chair. The original plan called for 5 strikes, but the sequence spiraled out of control, resulting in Foley taking 11 sickening blows to the skull while his hands were heavily handcuffed behind his back. His family was seated in the front row. His young children wept in genuine terror as they watched their father's brain endure legitimate trauma for the sake of a television storyline. His daughter Noelle admits that she has blocked out most memories of her father's matches due to the deep psychological trauma caused by that specific night. Medical professionals were horrified. A panel of neurologists warned Foley that if he continued his reckless style, he would inevitably end up permanently crippled. Foley struggled with basic memory retention, sometimes forgetting how to drive back to his own home due to compounding concussions. The long-term reality of this extreme career choice is sobering. The medical community now understands the devastating effects of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, a progressive brain disease linked to repetitive head trauma. The impacts Foley took were chemically comparable to being involved in multiple 25 miles per hour automobile collisions. His family lives with the daily, lingering fear of what his neurological health will look like in 10, 20 years. Foley faces this grim reality by keeping his mind hyperactive, performing spoken word shows to stimulate his brain, and hold on to the roar of the crowd he loves so deeply. Looking back at his legacy, there was a time when he harbored deep resentment toward the Hell in a cell match, feeling that his entire multifaceted career had been reduced to a single, terrifying stunt. But a profound conversation with The Undertaker shifted his perspective. The Undertaker reminded him that what they created that night in Pittsburgh would outlive them both. During a visit to the company's archival warehouse, Foley and his daughter stumbled upon the original steel cell. Upon touching the cold, rusted metal, the hardcore legend broke down in tears. It was a profound realization of his own mortality, recognizing how easily that structure could have served as his tomb. Was the sacrifice worth it? For Mick Foley, a man driven by a desperate need for authentic connection and the roar of strangers, the answer is complex. He admits that there is no financial reward significant enough to justify the extreme risks he took. armed with modern medical knowledge regarding head trauma, he cannot say with certainty whether he would change his past. He viewed the wrestling ring as a blank canvas, a platform to create surreal, sublime performance art. Despite the heavy physical toll and the lingering shadows of neurological damage, Foley remains deeply grateful for the magical, powerful feeling of standing in the center of the ring, listening to an arena full of people screaming his name. It is a hauntingly beautiful legacy of a man who literally gave his blood, sweat, and body to the industry he loved. Step into the annals of sports entertainment history, and you will find moments that defy logic, moments that challenge the very limits of human endurance, and moments that permanently alter the landscape of the industry. As a broadcaster who has sat ringside for decades, witnessing the evolution of the World Wrestling Federation, World Championship Wrestling, Extreme Championship Wrestling, and beyond, I have seen the spectacles that define careers, but there is one night, one specific match that stands alone as a monument to both absolute triumph and horrifying sacrifice. It was June 28th, 1998. The World Wrestling Federation was presenting its annual King of the Ring pay-per-view event inside the Pittsburgh Civic Arena. The marquee featured a structure that had only been seen once prior, Hell in a Cell. The combatants were two men whose legacies were already intertwined, The Undertaker and Mankind. To understand the magnitude of what transpired that evening, one must peel back the curtain and examine the psychological architecture of the man behind the Mankind mask, Mick Foley. According to those who know him best, including his wife of over 35 years, Colette Foley, the man outside the ring was gentle, armed with a penchant for corny jokes and terrible humor. Yet inside the squared circle, he was driven by an entirely different engine. By his own admission, Foley grew up as a target for teasing, developing an overwhelming, almost desperate need to be liked. When adoration was out of reach, he discovered a potent substitute, shock. According to Foley's own recollections, during his sophomore year of college, he orchestrated a stunt where he ingested red food coloring and leapt from a bed onto a concrete floor, violently spitting the red concoction to the horror of his dormitory peers. Hearing a female classmate declare it the most disgusting thing she had ever seen offered him a profound revelation. If he could not command love, he could command reactions through sheer, visceral shock. This psychological foundation would eventually build a hardcore legend. Before the World Wrestling Federation, Foley cultivated his craft in the brutal deathmatch of Japan. Accompanied by his mentor, the legendary Terry Funk, Foley engaged in contests featuring barbed wire fire and explosives. Documents and testimonies from that era suggest Foley would review up to 12 hours of Japanese wrestling tapes a day on a dilapidated videocassette recorder, studying the narrative power of realism. He believed that a match was only successful if he struggled to walk back to his hotel room. Pain was not something he enjoyed, but rather a currency he could trade for the audience's emotional investment. However, translating the hyperviolent style to the mainstream American stage was no simple task. During that era, the World Wrestling Federation was shifting from a family-friendly product to edgier content. But Vince McMahon was notoriously resistant to hiring Foley. According to Jim Ross, who served as vice president of talent relations at the time, McMahon did not believe Foley was marketable or aesthetically suited for a top-tier position. It required relentless lobbying from Ross to bring Foley into fold. When McMahon finally relented, he reportedly slammed his hand on a table, insisting that Foley's face be covered with a leather mask. Thus, the tortured character of Mankind was born. Mankind was designed to be the ultimate antagonist for the company's cornerstone attraction, The Undertaker. According to producer Gerald Briscoe, the character was entirely conceptual at first, a blank slate that only a performer with Foley's profound grasp of in-ring psychology could bring to life. Foley understood that to connect with an audience, a performer must make them suspend their disbelief. He was willing to sacrifice his own body to ensure the fans believed in the struggle. By the summer of 1998, Foley and The Undertaker had battled across the globe, clashing in 7 pay-per-view events and 10 television matches. Yet, Foley felt his character had reached a plateau. He needed a catalyst to reignite his career, and the looming Hell in a Cell match provided the perfect, albeit terrifying, canvas. The concept of Hell in a Cell had been established 9 months prior in a groundbreaking bout between The Undertaker and Shawn Michaels. It was a masterpiece that set an impossibly high standard. Seeking counsel, Foley approached Terry Funk in what started as a passing joke. Funk suggested they begin the match on the roof of the cage and have Foley thrown off. While Funk laughed, a seed was planted in Foley's mind. Driven by the fear of obsolescence and the relentless desire to deliver a spectacle, Foley pitched the idea to McMahon and The Undertaker. Despite initial reluctance from all parties, Foley's determination prevailed. When the night arrived, the atmosphere inside the arena was thick with anticipation. Commentators Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler were entirely unaware of the orchestrated chaos about to unfold. As Foley made his entrance, the 16,000 fans in attendance expected him to enter the steel structure. Instead, he began the perilous climb to the roof. According to Foley, despite his bravado, he was absolutely terrified of heights. When The Undertaker followed him to the top, the sheer physics of the situation became a terrifying reality. 600 pounds of humanity stood atop a chain-link mesh secured only by plastic zip ties. With every step, the roof sagged beneath their weight, the ties snapping like gunfire. Backstage, producers and fellow wrestlers watched the monitors in breathless silence. Referee Jimmy Corderas and other officials recognized that the margin for error was virtually non-existent. Then came the moment that suspended time. The Undertaker grabbed Mankind and hurled him from the edge of the cell. A 300-pound man plummeted almost 20 feet, crashing violently through the Spanish announcer's desk. The sound of the impact echoed through the arena like a detonation. Backstage, the reaction was sheer panic. Many believed they had just witnessed a fatality. The chaotic scene that followed was not part of any script. Emergency medical technicians rushed to the ringside area. Dr. Francois Petit, the company's physician, sprinted down the aisle to tend to the shattered performer. A stretcher was brought out. The match, by all logical metrics, was over. But the psychology of the hardcore legend is not governed by logic. As the stretcher began to move up the aisle, Foley, operating on pure adrenaline and a dangerous commitment to his craft, rolled off and stumbled back toward the ring. He climbed the cell a second time. What followed was the true tragedy of the evening. The second major fall was never meant to happen the way it did. The plan called for a choke slam on the roof to slowly break the mesh, culminating in a visual of Foley dangling above the ring. Instead, the roof completely gave way. Foley plummeted uncontrollably to the canvas below, hitting the concrete-like mat with devastating force. To compound the nightmare, a heavy steel folding chair fell through the opening, striking Foley squarely in the face upon his landing. For 42 seconds, Mick Foley was completely unconscious, according to backstage officials. This was the first time in his career he had been legitimately knocked out. The Undertaker, breaking character, peered down to the broken roof, instructing Terry Funk to check if Foley was still breathing. Funk brilliantly ad-libbed a physical confrontation with The Undertaker to buy precious time for Foley to regain his senses. In any other sport, in any other context, the contest would have been immediately terminated. But the culture of professional wrestling at that time dictated that the show must go on. When Foley finally regained consciousness, his immediate instinct was to create a memorable television image. With his jaw dislocated, a massive wound beneath his lip, and a dislodged tooth somehow lodged in his nasal cavity, he smiled for the cameras. The match continued for several more minutes, incorporating thousands of steel thumbtacks scattered across the mat. When the 17-minute ordeal finally concluded with The Undertaker victorious, the audience was left in a state of traumatized awe. Vince McMahon met Foley behind the curtain, expressing deep gratitude while strictly demanding that Foley never attempt something so reckless again. The physical toll was staggering. Foley suffered a dislocated jaw, a dislocated shoulder, a bruised kidney, multiple lost teeth, 15 facial stitches, and severe concussions. Yet, the emotional toll on his family was perhaps more profound. His wife, Colette, had to watch in agonizing suspense, her children believing they had watched their father perish on live television. The cautionary aspect of this narrative becomes sharply evident when examining the aftermath. Despite McMahon's warning, the culture of escalation persisted. Just 7 months later, Foley engaged in an I Quit match against The Rock. During this bout, Foley absorbed 11 unprotected steel chair shots to the head. His young daughter, Noelle, was in the front row, sobbing uncontrollably. Today, she admits she has no desire to watch her father's matches, harboring a deep hatred for the violence that altered her family's life. The long-term consequences of such extreme physical sacrifice are a grim reality of the industry. Medical professionals eventually advised Foley that he should never wrestle again due to cumulative brain trauma. The specter of chronic traumatic encephalopathy looms over his legacy, a terrifying unknown that Foley and his family must live with every single day. The brain damage sustained in the pursuit of entertainment is a stark reminder of the ultimate cost of the spotlight. Yet, when analyzing this sweeping saga, one must acknowledge the duality of Mick Foley's journey. For years, he harbored resentment that his entire multifaceted career was eclipsed by those horrific falls from the cell. He found himself in a dark, psychological space, feeling as though his other accomplishments meant nothing. It was only through deep reflection and conversations with peers like The Undertaker that Foley embraced a match as a defining masterpiece. As an observer of this magnificent, violent theater, I am left to ponder the ultimate question raised by the Hell in a Cell match. Foley achieved the adoration he sought since childhood. He created a piece of performance art that will outlive everyone who was in the arena that night. But when the cheers fade and the arena lights go dark, the pain remains. The legacy of Hell in a Cell is a breathtaking, heart-stopping testament to human willpower, forever intertwined with a sobering warning about the price of immortality. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a deep dive into what is arguably the most infamous spectacle in the history of professional wrestling. We are looking back at a night that forever altered the industry, a night where the boundaries of physical endurance and psychological sacrifice were pushed so far past the edge that we are still analyzing the fallout decades later. According to the historical records of the World Wrestling Federation, on the date of June 28, 1998, the annual King of the Ring pay-per-view event took place at the Pittsburgh Civic Arena in front of an audience of 16,000 people. On paper, it was a Hell in a Cell match pitting The Undertaker against Mankind. In reality, it was a descent into absolute chaos, a beautifully dangerous masterpiece that forces every single one of us to ask a very difficult question. Was it worth it? To truly comprehend the magnitude of this event, we must first analyze the psychology of the man behind the mask, Mick Foley. According to those who know him best, including his longtime friend and wife Colette Foley, Mick was a gentle and kind person with a terrible sense of humor. Yet, everyone who steps into a wrestling ring is searching for something missing in their own lives. Based on Foley's own accounts, his childhood was marred by teasing, leaving him with an overwhelming, desperate need to be liked and accepted. He craved the reaction of a crowd. Foley himself recalled a telling incident from his sophomore year in college. To gain the attention of his peers, he took a swig of red food coloring and launched himself off a bed onto a stuffed animal resting on a concrete floor, spitting the red liquid out upon impact. When a female student called it the most disgusting thing she had ever seen, Foley did not feel shame. He felt power. It was a psychological breakthrough. If he could not naturally make people love him, he realized he could capture their attention by disgusting them. This desperate need to elicit a reaction, any reaction, became the driving force of his career. He adopted the persona of Cactus Jack, a wild, seemingly insane character whose reputation was built on absorbing unbelievable punishment. To hone his craft, Foley immersed himself in the brutal world of Japanese wrestling, according to his recollections. He and his wife lived with a mattress on the floor and a broken television set, where he would consume up to 12 hours of Japanese wrestling tapes a day. He studied the storytelling, the realism, and the concept of a wrestler not just fighting an opponent, but fighting the harsh environment itself. It was in Japan that he found a mentor in the legendary Terry Funk. According to industry historians, Terry Funk possessed an unparalleled ability to make the audience suspend their disbelief. Together, they engaged in fiery, bloody death matches featuring barbed wire and concrete. For Foley, the pain was merely a tool. He believed that a match was only successful if he struggled to walk back to his hotel room afterward. He was willing to endure explosions, thumbtacks, and concrete, all to stand out and earn the awe of total strangers. Despite this dedication, breaking into the World Wrestling Federation was an uphill battle. The era was heavily regulated and family-friendly, completely contrary to Foley's ultra-violent style. According to Jim Ross, who served as vice president of talent relations at the time, Chairman Vince McMahon had zero interest in hiring Foley. McMahon did not find Foley marketable or physically appealing. However, Ross relentlessly vouched for Foley, arguing that they desperately needed a dynamic, unpredictable opponent for their top star, The Undertaker. According to former agent Gerald Briscoe, McMahon finally relented out of frustration, allegedly slamming his hand on a table and agreeing to hire Foley, but on one strict condition: they had to cover his face and build a character out of complete obscurity. That mandate led to the creation of Mankind, a deranged, tortured soul trapped behind a leather mask. Foley took this bizarre concept and poured his absolute commitment into it. The fans sensed that authenticity. Through 7 pay-per-view matches and 10 television matches, Mankind and The Undertaker traveled the globe, laying a foundation of incredible storytelling. But by the summer of 1998, Foley felt his character had plateaued. He needed to do something monumental to elevate their legacy rather than detract from it. The opportunity arrived in the form of the Hell in a Cell. The concept had only been executed once prior, featuring The Undertaker and Shawn Michaels. That initial encounter set a remarkably high standard for storytelling and violence. According to Foley, he felt immense pressure, knowing he lacked the athletic agility of Shawn Michaels. To figure out how to surpass the original, Foley consulted Terry Funk. According to the accounts of their conversation, Funk jokingly suggested that they start the match on top of the cage structure and that Foley should be thrown off. While Funk intended it as dark humor, Foley saw it as a legitimate strategy. Foley pitched the idea to McMahon and The Undertaker. According to those involved, The Undertaker was extremely hesitant to throw a man off a cage. Foley, however, was resolute. He later admitted that he was terrified of heights and had zero logical plan for how to safely descend from the structure. He viewed this stunt not as a way to launch the second act of his career, but merely as a desperate attempt to keep his head above water before walking away from the industry entirely. When the match commenced, the atmosphere in the arena was thick with tension. As the menacing music of The Undertaker echoed through the building, Mankind bypassed a locked door and began climbing the mesh structure. The sheer shock among the fans and the broadcast team was palpable. Legendary commentators Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler were completely in the dark, watching in disbelief as Foley dared The Undertaker to meet him on the roof. The structure itself was not designed to support 600 pounds of human weight on its roof. The top panels were secured with simple plastic zip ties. As the two heavyweights maneuvered on top, the mesh bowed a terrifying 1 foot downward. The chilling sound of zip ties snapping echoed through the arena. Down at ringside, veteran referee Jimmy Corderas sat beside the broadcast tables, watching the monitors closely. He knew the margin for error was perilously small. As the brawl moved toward the edge of the cell, disbelief turned to sheer horror. From an elevation of roughly 20 feet, The Undertaker grabbed Mankind and hurled him off the edge. According to eyewitnesses and broadcast footage, the massive 300-pound body plummeted through the air and crashed violently through the Spanish broadcast table. Jim Ross famously captured the terror of the moment, shouting out in genuine shock. Backstage, the locker room erupted in concern. According to former wrestler Al Snow, it was like witnessing a horrific automobile accident. Many believed they had just watched a man die on live television. Down at ringside, chaos ensued. Spanish commentator Hugo Savanovic had to throw himself out his chair to avoid being crushed. The ringside physician, Dr. Francois Petit, rushed to the wreckage. Terry Funk broke character and ran to his friend's side. Paramedics brought out a stretcher, preparing to transport Foley to the hospital. The match appeared to be over. Colette Foley, watching from home with their 2 young children, was paralyzed with fear, desperately trying to convince her children that it was all an act. Yet, the unimaginable happened. Against all medical advice and common sense, Foley rolled off the stretcher. Driven by adrenaline and an intoxicating dedication to his craft, he began to climb the cell once more. The audience, the commentators, and the backstage producers were completely dumbfounded. Why would a man who just survived a near-fatal fall return for more punishment? This brings us to the second, arguably more dangerous, fall of the evening. According to the meticulously planned script, the Undertaker was supposed to execute a choke slam on the roof, causing a section of the mesh to slowly give way, creating a dramatic visual of Foley hanging upside down. But professional wrestling is a live, unpredictable environment. When the Undertaker drove Foley into the mesh, the panel completely broke open. Foley plummeted straight through the roof, plummeting toward the ring below. Unlike the first fall, which was cushioned by a breakaway table, this time Foley hit the solid ring mat. In the wrestling industry, the ring surface is often compared to unforgiving concrete. To make matters worse, a heavy steel folding chair fell through the opening right behind him, striking him brutally in the face upon impact. The silence that fell over the arena was deafening. This was not planned. This was a catastrophic mechanical failure. Backstage, panic set in. Foley was not completely unconscious. The first time in his career he had suffered such severe head trauma in the ring. Dr. Petit and Terry Funk immediately entered the cage. According to Funk, he looked into Foley's eyes and saw nobody home. To buy the medical team precious time, Funk actively engaged the Undertaker in a brief, unscripted physical altercation to distract the audience and the cameras. For 42 agonizing seconds, Foley was unresponsive. When he finally regained consciousness, the extent of his injuries was horrifying. He had suffered a dislocated jaw, a dislocated shoulder, a bruised kidney, and a massive laceration under his lip that required 15 stitches. Most shockingly, the steel chair had knocked 2 teeth out of his mouth, and one of those teeth had somehow been forced up into his nasal passage. Yet, in a display of almost terrifying psychological resilience, Foley used his tongue to push through his open facial wound and smile for the cameras. He was still focused on entertaining the strangers in the audience. Despite suffering severe trauma, Foley insisted on finishing the match. He dragged himself through the remainder of the 17-minute bout, eventually demanding the introduction of sharp metal thumbtacks to the canvas. After being slammed onto the tacks, he finally stayed down, allowing the Undertaker to secure the victory. The immediate aftermath was a complex mix of reverence and reprimand. Backstage, Chairman Vince McMahon expressed profound gratitude for Foley's sacrifice, but issued a stern warning, demanding that Foley never attempt anything so recklessly dangerous again. His wife, Colette, was furious, according to her accounts. The lack of immediate communication following the event sparked deep anxiety and anger, as she realized her husband was willing to push his physical limits past the point of basic self-preservation. But the dark side of this narrative is that the applause became an addiction. The Hell in a Cell match elevated Mankind to superstardom. Within 6 months, he captured the World Wrestling Federation Championship. However, the expectations had been permanently altered. The bar for violence was raised, and Foley felt immense pressure to continuously deliver the extreme spectacles the audience now craved. This dangerous trajectory culminated just 7 months later in a brutal "I quit" match against The Rock. Despite warnings from producers regarding excessive blood loss, Foley insisted on absorbing unmitigated punishment. The script called for Foley to take 5 unprotected strikes to the head with a steel chair while his hands were restricted by metal handcuffs. In the heat of the moment, the plan derailed. According to the documentary accounts, Foley ended up taking 11 vicious, unprotected chair shots to the skull. The collateral damage extended far beyond the ring. His family was seated in the front row. His young daughter, Noelle, watched in horror as her father was bludgeoned. According to Noelle, the trauma that night completely erased any positive memories of her father's wrestling career. She noted that a normal human being could have easily lost their life from absorbing 11 direct blows to the head with a steel object. The physical toll of these decisions was devastating. Medical professionals and independent neurologists warned Foley that his continued participation in the sport would lead to severe, irreversible consequences. He was experiencing memory loss and geographical confusion while driving. The accumulation of concussions pointed toward long-term neurological deterioration. The medical consensus was clear. If he continued, he risked becoming permanently crippled. Decades later, the wrestling industry has completely changed its protocols regarding head trauma and match stoppages, largely due to the lessons learned from matches like these. The condition associated with repetitive brain trauma is a grim reality that hangs over Foley and his family. According to his daughter, the fear of his cognitive decline in 10 or 20 years is a daily, heavy burden. Yet, despite the immense physical and emotional costs, Foley has managed to find a complex peace with his past. For a time, he harbored deep resentment that his entire legacy was distilled into one catastrophic night in 1998. However, through conversations with peers like The Undertaker, he came to accept that they created a moment of television that will outlive them both. Today, he engages in spoken word tours, performing mental gymnastics to keep his mind sharp and continue feeling the warmth and acceptance of a live audience. When we analyze the legacy of Mick Foley and the Hell in a Cell, we are forced to confront the harsh realities of sports entertainment. Here is a man who sacrificed his bodily autonomy, his neurological health, and the peace of mind of his family, all for the roar of the crowd. According to Foley himself, he recognized that his success was inextricably tied to his willingness to endure suffering. It is a cautionary tale of a performer who treated the wrestling ring as a canvas for sublime performance art, painting a masterpiece with his own physical well-being. Ultimately, the archives reflect a night where reality violently pierced the veil of entertainment. The zip ties breaking, the table shattering, the chair falling from the roof. These were unscripted acts of gravity that no writer could have ever booked. The fact that he survived is a medical anomaly. The fact that we are still analyzing it serves as a testament to the enduring, complex, and sometimes disturbing power of professional wrestling. Ladies and gentlemen, step back in time with me to a night that forever altered the landscape of professional wrestling. The date is June 28, 1998. The stage is set at the Pittsburgh Civic Arena for the World Wrestling Federation's King of the Ring event. 16,000 eager fans have packed the arena, unaware that they are about to witness a spectacle that will test the very limits of human endurance and redefine the meaning of sacrifice in sports entertainment. On the marquee, a main event that sends chills down the spine of even the most hardened observer. The Undertaker facing off against Mankind in a structure known as Hell in a Cell. This match is not merely a chapter in wrestling history. It is a profound cautionary tale and a dangerous masterpiece. According to the accounts of those involved, the events that transpired inside, outside, and on top of that steel enclosure remain a subject of deep analysis and debate. It forces all of us to ask one chilling question. When is it enough? How far is a performer willing to go to secure their 15 minutes in the spotlight? To truly understand the absolute chaos of that night, we must first analyze the complex psychology of the man behind the Mankind mask, Mick Foley. Everyone who steps into the squared circle is looking for something they find missing in their own lives. For Foley, the drive was rooted in a desperate need for acceptance. As a young man who faced relentless teasing, he developed an overwhelming desire to be liked, to elicit a reaction from those around him. The documentary sources reveal a fascinating anecdote from his college days as a sophomore, seeking the attention of his peers. Foley took a swig of red food coloring and executed a flying leap off a bed, crashing onto a concrete floor. Upon impact, he spat the red liquid into the air. When a female student cried out that it was the most disgusting thing she had ever seen, Foley did not feel shame. He felt power. He realized that if he could not make people love him, perhaps he could disgust them. He just needed to get a reaction. This psychological foundation gave birth to a career built on unimaginable punishment. In Japan, under the mentorship of the legendary Terry Funk, Foley cultivated a reputation for extreme violence. He engaged in fiery death matches involving barbed wire, composition for explosives, and brutal falls onto solid concrete. Foley would consume up to 12 hours of Japanese wrestling television a day, studying the realism and the storytelling. For Foley, it was not merely man versus man. It was man versus his environment. He measured the success of his matches by the level of physical difficulty he experienced trying to walk back to his hotel room. Yet, beneath this gladiator exterior was a gentle, kind man. His wife, Colette, who married him to the theme song of Beauty and the Beast, saw past the violence to his corny jokes and warm heart. She understood his commitment to his craft, a commitment that would soon bring him to the grandest stage in America. However, arriving at that stage was an immense challenge. The World Wrestling Federation during that era was primarily producing content for general audiences, and Vince McMahon did not initially see value in Mick Foley. McMahon felt Foley lacked the traditional marketable look of a superstar. It took the relentless advocacy of Jim Ross, the vice president of talent relations, and producer Jim Cornette to convince McMahon to take a chance on him. The company desperately needed a formidable opponent for their marquee star, The Undertaker. McMahon finally agreed, but with a harsh caveat. He wanted Foley's face completely covered. From this corporate reluctance, the character of Mankind was born, a bizarre, deranged figure who would pull his own hair and rock back and forth. It was a concept that would have failed miserably with anyone else. But Foley's total commitment breathed life into it. He connected with the audience on a visceral level, proving that without character and emotional investment, athletic maneuvers are meaningless. By the summer of 1998, The Undertaker and Mankind had engaged in a grueling rivalry, battling across 7 pay-per-view events and 10 television matches globally. But Foley felt the character had plateaued. He needed to do something monumental to ensure his legacy. The answer came in the form of Hell in a Cell, a brutal concept featuring a steel cage with a roof, designed to ensure 2 men enter, but only one leaves. The Undertaker and Shawn Michaels had previously competed in the inaugural Hell in a Cell, setting a standard of excellence that seemed impossible to eclipse. Foley, admittedly not the most nimble athlete, looked at that previous match with open-jawed awe, wondering how he could possibly follow it. The strategy emerged from a casual, joking conversation with Terry Funk. Funk suggested starting the match on the roof of the cage and being thrown off. While Funk intended it as a joke, Foley saw a terrifying opportunity. Despite a profound fear of heights, he pitched the idea to Vince McMahon and The Undertaker. Undertaker was hesitant, understandably concerned about the catastrophic risks of throwing a 300-pound man off a structure almost 20 feet in the air. Yet, Foley was deeply persuasive. He viewed this match not as a second act in his career, but as a desperate bid for survival in an unforgiving industry. He kept the true extent of his terrifying plan hidden from his family. Colette Foley had prepared for the event by trusting her husband would not jeopardize his life, completely unaware of the horrifying spectacle that awaited. When the bell finally rings, the atmosphere inside the Pittsburgh Civic Arena is electric with confusion and anticipation. Instead of entering the cage, Mankind begins to climb the outer mesh. The shock on the faces of the fans and commentators is palpable. Then, The Undertaker follows. Almost immediately, the structural integrity of the cell is compromised. The roof section, secured only by plastic zip ties, begins to buckle and give way under 600 pounds of humanity. The sound of the ties snapping echoes like gunfire. The Undertaker actively prevents Foley from executing a suplex, acutely aware that the roof could completely collapse beneath them. The two giants brawl dangerously close to the edge of the cell, hovering directly above the Spanish announcer table. Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler watch in mounting dread. There's absolutely no margin for error. If the throw is too far, Foley lands in the crowd. If it is too short, he hits the exposed concrete floor. Then, the moment that stopped the collective heart of the wrestling world occurs. The Undertaker hurls mankind off the roof. For the spectators, the officials, and the television audience, time seems to stand still. A 300-pound man plummets almost 20 feet, crashing violently through the announcer table. The sickening sound of the impact is unforgettable. Hugo Savinovic, the Spanish commentator, barely escapes being crushed. Backstage, the locker room explodes in absolute panic. According to those watching the monitors, the general consensus was that Mick Foley had just died on live television. The immediate aftermath is a scene of frantic, legitimate concern. The fictional narrative vanishes instantly, replaced by the terrifying reality of a severe medical emergency. Terry Funk and World Wrestling Federation Dr. Francois Petit rush to the wreckage. Vince McMahon, breaking all character protocols, approaches the scene. Foley is completely motionless, surrounded by a stunned, silent crowd. Emergency medical technicians arrive with a gurney, but in a cruel twist of logistics, the gurney cannot fit through the aisle without raising the entire cell structure. As Foley is strapped down, his wife Colette sits at home with their two young children, frantically trying to convince them that their father is merely acting, while her own mind races with terror. But then, defying all medical logic and basic human instinct, Mick Foley rises from the gurney. The audience erupts into a frenzy of disbelief as this battered man, fueled by pure adrenaline, begins to climb the steel structure once again. Officials and colleagues plead with him to stop, to go to the hospital. But Foley is driven by a singular, overwhelming desire to deliver a masterpiece to the fans. The two warriors meet again on the compromised roof. This is where the narrative shifts from planned risk to near-fatal accident. Foley had planned for a choke slam that would slowly tear the mesh, allowing for a dramatic visual of the Undertaker forcing him through the steel. Instead, the mesh completely gives way instantly. Foley plummets directly through the roof, plummeting toward the concrete hard-ring canvas below. Unlike the first fall, which Foley meticulously calculated to land flat on the table, this second fall is completely uncontrolled. He hits the ring mat with sickening force, and in a devastating stroke of bad luck, a heavy steel folding chair follows him down, violently striking him directly in the face. This was not planned. This was an unmitigated disaster. The arena falls into a horrifying hush. Foley lies completely unresponsive. According to his own testimony, this was the first time in his career he had been legitimately knocked out cold, losing 42 seconds of his life to the darkness. The Undertaker, looking down to the torn roof, is visibly shaken, later instructing Terry Funk to check if Foley is even breathing. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, Funk brilliantly improvises, attacking the Undertaker to draw attention away from the motionless Foley, buying crucial time for the medical staff. When Foley finally regains consciousness, his first sight is Terry Funk's shoes. With a dislocated jaw, a bruised kidney, a dislocated shoulder, and a massive wound beneath his lip, Foley's instinct for showmanship takes over in a way that is profoundly disturbing yet incredibly magnetic. He realizes one of his knocked-out teeth has somehow become lodged inside his nostril. In a moment of pure macabre theater, he smiles to the camera, showcasing the gruesome injury. He had pushed his body far beyond its natural limits, entirely consumed by the roaring approval of the audience. The match miraculously continues. Foley demands the introduction of thousands of sharp metal thumbtacks into the ring. intentionally throwing his own battered body onto them to ensure the audience receives maximum value. Finally, after 17 excruciating minutes, The Undertaker secures a victory. The crowd is in a state of absolute awe. They have witnessed a level of dedication and physical sacrifice that is almost incomprehensible. Backstage, the atmosphere is somber and intense. Vince McMahon approached Foley, expressing profound gratitude for his sacrifice, but delivering a stern, unequivocal directive. Never do anything like that again. The medical staff begins the arduous process of plucking thumbtacks from his skin and addressing his severe trauma, which included 15 stitches and a bruised kidney that would plague him for 6 weeks. Meanwhile, his wife Colette endures hours of agonizing silence, waiting for a phone call that is terrifyingly delayed. When they finally speak, the trauma of the evening forever alters her perspective on his career, replacing trust with constant, nagging fear. The Hell in a Cell match fundamentally changed McFoley's trajectory, catapulting him into superstardom and leading to a World Wrestling Entertainment Championship just 6 months later. But the collateral damage was immense, and the cycle of violence did not end. Just 7 months after the Cell, Foley found himself in an I Quit match against The Rock. Handcuffed and defenseless, Foley had instructed his opponent to deliver unsparing blows. The plan called for 5 strikes with a steel chair. Instead, Foley endured 11 brutal, unprotected strikes to the head. His young children, Noel and Mickey, watched in horror from the front row, traumatized by the sight of their father being systematically destroyed for the sake of television entertainment. This brings us to the profound consequences of such extreme physical storytelling. According to medical professionals mentioned in the documentary sources, the human brain is not designed to withstand the equivalent of repeated 25-mile-per-hour car crashes. Following the I Quit match, Foley exhibited terrifying symptoms of neurological trauma. He would drive his car and suddenly realize he had no memory of how to get home. A visit to an independent neurologist resulted in a grim, definitive warning. He needed to stop wrestling immediately or risk permanent, crippling damage. Today, the specter of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, a degenerative brain disease caused by repeated head trauma, looms heavily over the Foley family. His daughter explicitly states her daily fear for his cognitive future, wondering what his condition will be in 10 or 20 years. To combat the intellectual decline, Foley engages in spoken word tours, performing mental gymnastics to keep his mind sharp while still experiencing the roar of the crowd he so desperately craves. Looking back, the legacy of that June night in 1998 is deeply complicated. For a long time, Foley harbored resentment that his entire diverse career was overshadowed by those 17 minutes of sheer brutality. Yet, a poignant moment captured at the corporate warehouse, where Foley broke down in tears upon touching the rusted steel of the original Cell, reveals a profound acceptance. He acknowledges that the match will outlive them all. Mick Foley offered his physical health on the altar of sports entertainment, utilizing his body as a canvas for sublime, terrifying performance art. He risked everything to feel the undeniable power of a crowd's adulation. Was it worth the memory loss, the physical deterioration, and the terror inflicted upon his family? He admits that he cannot state with absolute certainty that he would have altered his path even if. He fully grasped the long-term consequences of head trauma at the time. He lived his dream, creating a masterpiece of danger and drama that remains unrivaled. It was a magical way to make a living, but a living that demanded a price few could ever afford to pay. The Hell in a Cell remains a monument to the unbreakable human will, a testament to the